Ladies and gentlemen, today we just got some shocking news coming out of Canada, and I'll tell you what, right now, things are not looking good for Canada's progressive Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Now, as many of you know, just a couple of weeks ago, Canada decided to officially lock in Mark Carney as their new Prime Minister because he promised to be tough on President Trump's tariffs. Hilariously, even though being a radically progressive globalist, Mark Carney was able to campaign on this notion of Canadian nationalism. That being said, as many of you know, Mark Carney actually surrendered to President Trump's tariffs before he had even officially won the Canadian election. It was a total betrayal of all of the Canadians that voted for him. So it's because of Mark Carney's shady behavior that now both Canadian conservatives and Canadian progressives pretty much unanimously hate the guy. And so this is what brings us to today's bombshell news. But before we take a look at that, I do want to say real quick that if you guys enjoy the daily news updates, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a lot. But okay, check this out. You see, for the last couple of weeks, there's been a growing Albertan separatist movement. Pretty much the entire province of Alberta wants to separate from Canada altogether so that they can forge their own destiny without being pressed under the globalist thumb of Mark Carney. The vast majority of Albertans totally reject Mark Carney's progressive globalist policies, rather choosing to embrace provincial sovereignty and economic freedom. You see, well over 90% of Canada's energy is actually produced in Alberta, meaning that it's the Albertans that keep the lights on for the entire country. However, despite this very simple fact, Mark Carney is already working to undermine and destroy Alberta's energy sector. But that's not even the worst of it. Not only does Alberta produce almost all of Canada's energy, but out of all of the Canadian provinces, Alberta has the highest GDP at around $334 billion per year. So very clearly, Canada's progressive leadership is trying to sabotage Alberta's position of economic dominance. And so, folks, it's all of this that directly leads us into today's bombshell news. You see, a massive survey conducted just a couple days ago just confirmed that 55% of Canadians nationwide across the entire country say that they understand and empathize with Alberta's goal of separating from Canada, with a whopping 70% of Albertans themselves saying that they understand why provincial separation is needed. Now, folks, keep in mind just how progressive Canada is, generally speaking, of course, but still, 55% of Canadians nationwide say that they understand why Alberta wants to leave. That means that even the progressive Canadians are like, yeah, I get it. But you know what? This entire situation with Mark Carney actually gets even worse. You see, if there's one thing that most people can agree on, it's that free speech is sort of this singular fundamental idea that modern Western society is built upon. Well, as it would turn out, Mark Carney doesn't actually share that belief. In fact, take a look at this.
Large American online platforms have become seas of racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate in all its forms. And they're being used by criminals to harm our children. My government will act. And today we're announcing our plan to fight crime, to protect Canadians, and to build communities that are safe, secure, and strong. A plan to make Canada secure, to make Canada strong.
So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. Prime Minister Mark Carney has decided that because his radically progressive Canadian regime can't regulate all of the free speech going on American social media platforms, he's going to label all of it as hate speech, whatever that means, so that he has a justification for mass censorship. And so at this point, I think it's worth quickly mentioning that we don't have a concept of free speech in order to protect speech that no one has an issue with. The entire point of protecting free speech is so that people can say against the grain controversial things. That's quite literally the entire point. So the second the government starts saying things like, yeah, we like free speech, but you can't say that because it's hate speech, so we're not going to allow it. Folks, that is when you have a massive problem. You'll notice that here in the USA, our First Amendment doesn't have a hate speech clause because hate speech doesn't exist. In fact, the entire notion of hate speech was explicitly invented so that the government could have a reason to tell you what you can and can't say. Because keep in mind, it's the government, in this case Mark Carney, who gets to decide how all of these words are defined. He gets to decide what hate speech even is. And so, folks, what do you say we go ahead and just call a spade here? The only reason that Prime Minister Mark Carney is pushing for social media censorship under the guise of hate speech is because right now he's absolutely terrified that Canadian conservatives are rallying together and the Alberta separatist movement is gaining serious momentum. What he wants to do is start selectively silencing the voices of conservative Canadians so that they can't band together and organize themselves. That is exactly what's going on here. But you know what? Here's the truth. In a sense, Mark Carney absolutely should be worried right now. Take a look at this. Just a couple weeks ago, Albertan Premier Danielle Smith issued a public statement saying that she would personally hold a referendum for Albertan separation in 2026 if Albertans are able to gather the required number of signatures to make it happen. And now, folks, here's where things get crazy. Less than 2 weeks ago, Alberta passed a piece of legislation called Bill 54, which effectively lowered the number of signatures needed for a separation referendum from 600,000 signatures down to just 177,000 signatures. Which means that without a shadow of a doubt, in 2026, Alberta's separation referendum is absolutely going to happen. And so, folks, let's relate all of this back to the USA here for a moment, because keep in mind, President Trump has been talking a lot about Canada lately, and as many of you know, Albertan Premier Danielle Smith recently had a one-on-one meeting with President Trump just a couple months ago down in Mar-a-Lago. So hey, who knows, maybe right this very moment, Alberta is stepping out of one door and right into another one. Maybe by the end of President Trump's second term, Alberta ends up actually becoming our 51st state, and then we'll need to put another little white star on the American flag. But either way, regardless of what happens up in Canada, down here in the USA, we are going to keep on putting America first. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we wrap up, I do want to say real quick that we officially have a Morse News Twitter page as well as a Morse News Facebook page. So if you use either of those platforms, please go down below and drop a follow in order to get breaking news updates that relate to everything we talk about here in the YouTube videos. But everyone, that is going to be a wrap for today's video, so please go down below and drop a comment. Let me know what you think about all of this. Please like the video while you're down there, and like I said earlier, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a ton. Thank you all very much for tuning in today, and of course, as always, stay safe.